But what I was particularly interested in was this notion of the singular screen, how we all watch this artificial frame and have grown to become associated with it. Isn't it interesting that we watch basically all our plastic arts in a frame?
Peter Greenaway's provocatively titled lecture, "The Cinema is Dead, Long Live the Cinema," touches upon cinema's fixation and preference for the totality and singleness of the master frame. He says that cinema is predominantly visual text, that almost all cinema comes from pre-written text. And while I don't think it's a particularly compelling argument, I absolutely understand what he's getting at, and why it's important to visual structure. Scenes you witness have a flow to them that have a lot of history in text, and most of them are spaced through shots, through scenes, and through sequences. You move on from shot to shot, scene to scene, but most movies and TV shows adopt a fairly consistent, singular frame. And any use of split screens, as you might see in something like Norman Jewison's The Thomas Crown Affair, is primarily due to more classical rules of paneling. Parts converge through competing space, creating what Lev Manevich calls a spatial montage, where elements come together to give implicit meanings. Anime likes to follow these same rules. For instance, if you look at a show like Lucky Star, split screens are usually used as setups to telephone conversations, but they're also used in spatial montages. In episode 2, when the girls are having their homework session, we find out more information as to how and where Tsukasa and Konata failed. This separation of space yet convergence of time underlines a really thoughtful and laconic structure. And while it's not the most innovative, I think the totality of the scene and how it means to convey struggle is shown in the contrast between someone who works hard and someone who doesn't, and ultimately just how seemingly unfortunate Tsukasa is. This compare and contrast only exists in the empty space, the split screens. And this is where we get to Gate. I think the show's use of the split screen is very intriguing, but I don't think it's meaningful to recall any classical use of paneling. There's a fantastic review by Banjo the Bear where he briefly posits reasons as to why the split screens of Gate are used. The first is that it foregrounds the visual style. The second is that it replicates the feeling of the news. And the third is that it creates a sense of disparity, accentuating conflict and difference. These are all incredibly valid reasons as to why Gate uses the split screen, and for many parts that's actually true. Conversations that are split screen oftentimes focus on contrast, honing in on the reactions of the people compared to others, but it's not always, and I think further abstraction of Gate's use of the split screen can give us a little bit more of a higher concept. After all, it's hard to find what and where the split screen has changed in modern day cinema, since its use has evolved as the medium that depicts visual media evolved. In fact, if we recall Manevich's work, we can find a medium where the split screen reigns supreme.
Tell me if this is you. You make art, or movies, or write or perform, or know someone who does, and you feel a little bit of fear about your or their chances of succeeding. It's not clear how things work, or you've heard the crazy odds, and you know that the history of art is filled with brilliant people who died unrecognized. I think...
The computer. How often do we watch media on our computers? How often do we watch media while something is playing in the background? How often do we watch media while doing something, while something is begging for our attention? This is where I think Gate is drawing its influence from. Not from classical use of the split screen and not from cinematic rules, but from new media defined by various screens around us, a bombardment of information, an assault of exposition and presentation. Manevich's departure from the montage of time and towards the montage of space is one that foregrounds the medium as a vital part in understanding the message being presented. Gate's use isn't a callback to a classical epistemology of cinema, but rather an embracing of new media, and, to quote Jim Bazzacci, a hyper-mediated attraction that calls attention to itself, and therefore to the process of mediation. In other words, there's a fourth reason. It's because it doesn't trust that you're going to pay attention to the sequence of its scenes, and therefore has to fight for it. And as a result, it will sometimes create informational density across space instead of time. For instance, the most famous and arguably infamous one is the split screen of the soldiers and the helicopters as they descend upon Italica. Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries is playing. It's an obvious recall to Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 film Apocalypse Now. Coppola's original sequence isn't a series of spatial montages, but temporal ones. In Gate, the scene's split screens are distinctly spatial. There's little news to replicate here, there's little disparity to accentuate, and I think there's little artistic beauty to behold. But there is modal and arguably redundant density. The split screen operates on the assumption that even if you're not paying attention, the busyness of the master frame makes it incredibly difficult to miss. If you miss the player, you won't miss the choppers, but if you miss the choppers, you won't miss the speakers. It constantly draws attention to itself. The same is seen in the first episode where the government is responding to the crisis by sending troops into the gate. The imposition of these elements creates a busy space that's nevertheless incredibly easy to consume. We can find the same happening in the discussion between Sugawara, Pina, and the senator. We can find it in the discussion in the cabinet on what to do. Images no longer depend on previous scenes to contextualize information, but compete for attention within the exact same frame, creating a starkness that flourishes in multitasking. Through the split screen, Gate draws attention to itself, acutely aware that it's competing for the audience's attention. But why is it doing this? If the split screen is a reflection of a hypermediated environment where information is combating for the viewer's attention, why is it something worth using? Why would anyone think this is something that works? I think it's because Gate is trying to be very structurally modern. Gate's subject matter is one that's covered in a lot of Japanese media and studies. Nationalist rhetoric and semiotics have been in Japanese manga and anime for a very long time. For instance, consider Hajime no Ippo's 408th chapter, which frames the characters as pilots. I think Matthew Penny puts it as clearly as possible. The Boxers were not pilots. They did not fight in the war, and Japan had no air power early in the occupation, all aircraft having been destroyed following the surrender. This is a fantasy image, included at the beginning of a chapter, and has nothing to do with the narrative. It very clearly, however, relates a vaguely conceived war with post-war acts of defending Japanese honor. And this intertwining of honor, identity, and war in Japan is something Gate attempts to tackle. After all, its successful repelling of foreign special forces argues that Japan is capable of defending itself and doesn't need America's security umbrella. Yanagita's questioning of the world's resources and Itami's job to go out and find resources is recollective of Japan's imperialistic rhetoric, reframed as something necessary, but also benign. The slimy behavior of anti-JSDF politicians and reporters personify the anti-war attitude that's challenged a push for force projection. And it's no surprise that Gate foregrounds two countries, the first being America, the country that's been Japan's major post-war security benefactor, but also the major actor in its quote-unquote military neutering, and the second being China, the country that's been encroaching on what the Japanese have always considered their East Asian regional hegemony, as evidenced in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands incident, as big political antagonists. That's sort of the interesting part of Gate. It doesn't bring anything new to the literature of Japanese nationalism, but there is a considerable amount in what I believe is an attempt to foreground traditional nationalist narratives into a modern visual grammar. Gate's messages are intertwined with technologies that are reflective of a modern system, and this reconfiguration may be an attempt to stress how these concerns are still relevant to the country today, that they aren't bygone debates of bygone eras. And while I don't agree with the messages it supports, and I don't think it's doing it as well as it should, I can respect it for what I believe to be an incrementally explorative attempt by an otherwise really lackluster show to drag really conservative ideas into a new media.
わかってます。もちろん機密情報の開示には